fires in California, which are tearing through celebrity parts of LA. 30,000 people, presumably not all celebrities, have been forced out of their homes. And a body has been found in the search for two British hikers who've been missing in the Dolomites in Italy for almost a week. 36-year-old Aziz Ziriat and 35-year-old Sam Harris haven't been heard from since New Year's Day. And Piers Morgan is leaving News UK to make his YouTube channel Uncensored a standalone business. News UK, which owns Times Radio, will stay as a partner for the next 4 years. We'll have a full news roundup at 1 p.m. But now, live on Times Radio, it's time for this.
PMQs Unpacked on Times Radio. Unpacking the politics and cutting through the crossfire.
Yes, it's time for PMQs Unpacked, and I am joined, as so often, as I always should be, by the Sunday Times Sunday chief political commentator, Tim Shipman. Hello, Tim.
Hello, Hugo. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. And also, as I should be frequently, if not always, Alistair Barrie, the comedian. Hello, Alistair. How are you?
I'm very well, and Happy New Year to you both.
I do like this saying Happy New Year, even though it's the 8th. I haven't seen either of you this year. I'm allowed to say it. That does mean if there's anyone I don't see until June, I'm going to sound a bit weird. But nonetheless, this is definitely what I'm doing. We're also live on the Times Radio YouTube channel. So welcome to anybody watching there. Do go find us if you can. That you'll have to search for us, but do so. It's the Times Radio YouTube channel. We will be there. Look, what's going to happen, Tim? Well, is this going to be grooming? Elon Musk grooming?
Well, the big question really is whether Prime Minister Elon Musk is planning to join us today to face the questioning that he needs about his many interventions. I mean, my reflection is that we all went for a lie down over Christmas, and we've come back, and somehow British politics has gone more bizarre than it was in the last quarter of last year. So, I would imagine it's going to be grooming. Kemi, Badenoch reform, both on a mission. Starmer back to the wall a little bit on it, though apparently coming out swinging yesterday and keen to sort of put their side of things, and they're playing hardball on this bill as well. I mean, you would have thought Labour, with a majority of a squillion, could vote down whatever tricksiness that Conservatives get around to playing at. But, passions are running high, so I'm expecting fireworks.
Well, I mean, what's interesting is there is real bad blood and anger over this because, I mean, it was just there in the news roundup I just gave, but the fact that if they do pass the amendment and call for another inquiry, that will kill the children's bill, which itself is meant to include new protections on abuse. So in order to have an inquiry, you're knocking down the protections that the government wants to do. I mean, that's a really febrile, fighty thing to be going on.
It's a horrible thing to be doing, but as I just said to Tim outside before we came in, as the registered expert on this panel, that surely Labour have got a massive majority, can't they do this? And even Tim, who's, as I say, far more knowledgeable than me, went, I don't really understand it either. So it's horrific, and it seems to be cynical. There's a very interesting point by Marina Hyde, I thought, that when Starmer, in the run-up to the elections, did a thing about Rishi Sunak, saying, do you want to let sexual predators off the hook? He does. If you're going to go low, we end up here. But where we are at the moment is I think not only did we have a lie down over Christmas, we all woke up with the sort of hangover that really affects your behaviour the next day.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm sort of hoping for something, sort of much more fun, such as Kemi Badenoch saying to the Prime Minister, do you think that America should annex Greenland, for example?
Well, that would be nice.
That should be an easy one to answer. I think we've got the first question. Let's go to that right now.
Mr. Speaker, the whole House has heard that the Prime Minister lost his brother during the Christmas period. So can I offer him, on behalf of my party, our sincerest condolences? Yeah. The new year has started with a focus on the decades-long rape gang scandal. Across the country, thousands of girls were tortured and sexually abused at the hands of men who treated them as things to be used and disposed of, destroying many lives forever. The Prime Minister has mentioned previous inquiries. He is right. There has been an inquiry into child sexual abuse, but it wasn't about the rape gang scandal. In its 468 pages, it mentioned Rotherham just once. Is the Prime Minister confident that we know the full extent of rape gang activity?
Minister.
Can I first thank her for her condolences, and can I thank her for reaching out over the Christmas period when I lost my brother? I really did appreciate that, and I appreciate it today. Mr. Speaker, on the question of a further inquiry, there have been a number of inquiries, some of them localised, including the Mayor of Manchester's inquiry recently, and of course a national inquiry Professor Jay carried out, took 7 years, had 20 recommendations, none of which actually were implemented by the party opposite when they were in government. Now, This is a really serious issue. We must focus, obviously, on the victims and survivors. There's no fixed view on the victims and survivors about a further national inquiry. There are mixed views. But there is a view, and I share this view, that what is needed now is action on what we already know. We already know, myself from personal knowledge when I was Chief Prosecutor, that warped ideas, myths and stereotypes about victims were at the heart of this. We've known that for a decade. The J report called for mandatory reporting. I called for it 11 years ago. What we need now is action. What can't be tolerated is the idea that this afternoon members opposite will vote down a bill which protects children, include Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me just. One of the provisions in the bill is to protect children vulnerable today who are out of school to prevent abusers ever taking those children out of school. I implore members opposite to defy the misleading leadership of the Leader of the Opposition and vote for a really important bill.
That's fascinating. That's basically like two people who know they're about to have a huge argument and so approach each other really, really carefully at first. I think the first sort of blow being landed there was Keir Starmer quietly pointing out that none of the 20 recommendations in the J inquiry were implemented by the last government. But there's also this dynamic here, isn't there, Tim, of Kemi Badenoch is keen to attack him on this, but he really, really knows what he's talking about because he worked on this for years and years and years. He's not just been Googling it in sort of frantically for the last week, like perhaps she has. He's worked on this for a significant proportion of his career, and it's really going to war with somebody over something that they are an expert in.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's an interesting, it's a bit like the phony war, isn't it? That was a bit of Norway before the full-blown invasion of France, wasn't it? I mean, Badenoch, did the sort of, sorry about your brother bit. And I was wondering, she started talking about grooming gangs, and if previous form had been anything to go by, she would have then pivoted to talk about,
the
clothes
space
or
race
something.
or anything.
But as it was, we've got away from that sort of Badenoch habit. So we're on the terrain where we expected to be. But there are points on both sides here. And pretty telling is that we have 20 recommendations and the Tories didn't implement them. I think even Robert Jenrick, who did a pretty decent fist of laying into the government over the weekend, was forced to say that 2 of them were in the process of being delivered but had not been delivered. So the other 18 weren't being delivered at all. And when Starmer said that, Jess Phillips, who's sitting on the front bench and has had a pretty torrid week herself from Elon Musk, did that sort of OK zero sign, and then it went and opened up, and she was just doing that at the government front bench. Zero. You did none of it. So, but even Starmer pulled his punches a little bit there. Talked about the misleading leadership of the leader of the opposition. I think this feels like a volcano about to blow, but it hasn't quite blown yet.
Alistair,
Yeah, no, I think, as you say, fascinating. My first thoughts were, this appears refreshingly grown up, which is going to be very famous last words from me, because it was, you can't start with condolences and then go straight in, and it was done gently and it seemed sensibly. And I mean, the idea that Kemi Badenoch has been Googling, I think, is an absolute travesty. She's clearly been scrolling through X. So I don't know, as Tim says, I feel very much that we were just laying some sort of constructive groundwork that is about to be ripped asunder.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair. It's sort of like if you're at a party and 2 people look like they're having a civil conversation to everyone around them, but you're on the other side of the room and you know how that's going to go, and you're running across going, no, because you can see exactly how that's going to go. I think we have the second question. Let's listen to that.
Mr. Speaker, I'm shocked that the Prime Minister would say that actions were not taken. He knows full well that we accepted 18... He knows full well that we accepted 18 of the 20 recommendations in the J inquiry and went further, launching a gangs task force that found 550 more perpetrators. That shows that there is still work to be done. In Rotherham alone, there have been over 1,400 victims. Across Oldham, Bradford, Bristol, Rochdale, and dozens more towns, there have been thousands more victims. But no one has joined the dots. No one has the total picture. And it is almost certainly still going on. one victim from Telford, and I know he says that victims have different views. We have different views across this house. But one victim from Telford says she wants a national inquiry because it will hold people accountable in a way that previous inquiries have not. It is very possible to have actions, take on more, and still have a national inquiry. So why won't he listen to victims and launch a national inquiry which would have the power to summon witnesses and make them give evidence under oath?
Mr. Speaker, she says they accepted the recommendations. They didn't act on them. Exactly. One of the central recommendations was mandatory reporting, and it still hasn't been enacted. I called for this 11 years ago. They've been tweeting and talking. We've been acting. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition has been an MP, I think, for 8 years. Her party have been in government for 7.5 of those 8 years. She was the Children's Minister. She was the Women's and Equalities Minister. I can't recall her once raising this issue in the House, once calling for a national inquiry. It's only in recent days she's jumped on the bandwagon. Now, Mr. Speaker, in fairness, if I'm wrong about that, and she has raised it, then I invite her to say that now, and I will happily withdraw the remark that she hasn't raised it in this House in the 8 years that she's been here until today.
Well, I was going to leave you hanging on tenterhooks there.
Well, someone in Labour research has been trawling through Hansard and has presumably found nothing. But it may be they've searched for the wrong things, and we may be about to find out.
Yeah, he seemed to be slightly panicking at the end there.
Well, you've got to sort of
yeah.
you know.
I mean, the fact that she was Children's Minister, Women and Equalities Minister, in the actual government that could have done this, that could have responded to this report, that could have enacted this report and didn't enact this report. Once upon a time, that would have mattered.
It should still matter, but I don't know if you would agree with me, either of you, on this, but I think Badenoch has been a bit more grown up. There's a sort of slight New Year's change to her, that she has not gone quite so gung-ho. And, I mean, you know, one thing, as he says, to accept recommendations, a totally different one to enact them. But she does, I mean, still have that feeling of two boxers squaring off around each other and the haymakers are about to come out. But I was quite surprised by how sort of sensible she was.
Well, look, if you charge him with both feet, and Starmer then responds like that, you look rather silly. As it is, he made a good point. She has a reasonable point that probably we don't know the full scope of this, and is there a case for putting people on oath and making sure we do know it? But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing something in the meantime to enact what has already been recommended. I think, you know, any sort of reasonable-minded person is going to conclude that they both got a point here, and maybe it pays them both not to sort of turn this into a complete slanging match. But in terms of the debate, you know, Starmer's had pretty solid responses so far.
Well, look, we've left you on that cliffhanger for long enough. Let's see what Kemi Badenoch comes back with.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is being very specific because I have raised this issue. I've raised it in speeches. I've raised it publicly. He knows that as a minister, I would not have been speaking on this specific issue. I was not a Home Office minister. But Mr. Speaker, I will remind him about other victims who came to me, who I did help. The victims of the Tavistock scandal, who came to me as a minister. I didn't send them away like his safeguarding minister. I made sure, as his Labour Party were calling me transphobic, that we launched the CAS review, which even his health secretary has accepted. So we do right by victims, Mr. Speaker. The reason why a national inquiry is important is because this issue is systemic. It has been involving local and national officials, the police, prosecutors and politicians. He talks about some of the local inquiries, but these interlinked issues cannot be covered by local inquiries alone. In fact, the leaders of the Manchester inquiry resigned because they couldn't get evidence, they couldn't summon witnesses, and not a single person in a position of authority has been held to account. The Prime Minister called for 9 inquiries in the last Parliament. Does he not see that by resisting this one, people will start to worry about a cover-up?
Mr. Speaker, this is an important issue, and we have to focus on the victims and survivors, and it isn't helpful. this sort of lies and misinformation and slinging of mud doesn't help them one bit. Mr. Speaker, she raised a question of a victim with me, and quite right to, and I accept that victims and survivors are in different places on this. Those that I've spoken to are worried about the delay of a further inquiry. The last inquiry took 7 years. That would take us to 2031. Now, these inquiries, amongst the issues that's been raised with me, and if she's been speaking to victims, they'll have raised this with her, is that it's very hard for victims and survivors to come forward to explain what's happened to them. They do not want to be rushed through this process, which is why the last one took 7 years. It's not sensible to suggest that this can be done in a hurry, on the cheap, and comprehensively. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, that would take us to, let's say, 2030, 2031. The victims that I've spoken to want action today. I agree with them on that. But what I don't understand, I genuinely don't understand, is why anybody today would vote against the Children Wellbeing Bill, which will protect children who are vulnerable today. It will kill the bill. It will stop those provisions for children exposed at risk today. I implore them, vote for the bill. Don't wreck this in this misguided way.
Okay, so there's substance to talk about. We'll talk about it in a minute. But that Keir Starmer, that pleading, please don't do this, this would be bad, that's a tone from him I've not seen before, I think.
Yeah, I mean, he's quite defensive about the whole thing. I mean, I do find it odd, as we've discussed before. I mean, they can vote this down very easily and have this debate at, at report stage and in committee. I mean, that's how you amend legislation. You don't go and vote it down at second reading. So, from that point of view, from a boring procedural point of view, Starmer's got a point. But, everyone's playing politics here. The Tories want it on the record that they support an inquiry, and they want Labour to vote against that. Labour, in turn, will say, well, you're voting against these protections for children. But the tone has still been fairly grown up. Badenoch made clear, I think, that Starmer had made a sort of specifically accurate point about how often she's spoken, but says that, that wasn't my ministerial responsibility, but I raised it elsewhere. And she makes the point. I mean, he's accused her of bandwagon jumping. I mean, he was accused a lot of that, particularly in the early stages as leader of the opposition. And as she pointed out, he called for 9 inquiries. So this is one of those where it's a sort of grown-up debate, and there's actually quite a lot of light as well as slightly less heat than we were expecting. And I stick to the view that there's points on both sides. I
mean, she says it wasn't her ministerial responsibility, but she was children's minister. So if it wasn't her ministerial responsibility, then that's
well, it's a curious.
Whose fault is that?
That is quite. It is a curious state of if you go on the gov.uk website, you will see what specifically is each minister's responsibility, and ministers' responsible things don't take too kindly to colleagues weighing in on their terrain. That's just a fact of life. But clearly, it's an issue that perhaps she might have paid more attention to and shown more interest in. And there might be stories now of how she lobbied hard behind the scenes to get the Home Office to do more about it, given her great concern about children. We haven't heard any of that. But on the specific point, there seemed to be, she's defended herself.
Alistair.
But again, grown-up points on both sides. I do think, 2 implores from Keir. Now we'd want to. That's quite a lot. But I think it's nice to see. I mean, we are still going. When are they going to start doing what we all expect them to do? The thing is, there's this huge elephant in the room, or excuse me for this, but an Elon-elephant, because the whole reason we're having this ridiculous this is all blown up is because a lunatic who takes medical ketamine when he's having trouble concentrating has put out 200 tweets about this, most of which are incredibly baseless. What did he call Jess Phillips?
Genocide rape apologist.
Genocide rape apologist. Famous John Peel.
I mean, if you're going to go over the top, you might as well go out with all.
Well, absolutely. But at the same time, it is the elephant in the room that we're discussing this. And I mean, I thought there was a little product reform there about an inquiry on the cheap because Nigel's offered to set one up. But I love the grown-up tone. It doesn't make me feel very confident it's going to stay.
I mean, I wonder if Musk does get a mention, if that'll be when Nigel Farage pops up with his question. No, obviously he won't mention it, but someone might in reply.
Not now that he's called for him to move on.
Let's get our next question.
Mr. Speaker, it is very possible to have shorter inquiries, especially if they are covering areas that have not been looked at yet. We don't need to repeat the work that has already been done. Let's look at new areas. Former Labour MP Anne Cryer said that there were councillors and MPs all over the country who knew what was going on but were terrified of being labelled racist. A national inquiry would ask if there was a racial or cultural motivation to some of these crimes where white girls were seen, as Jack Straw said, as easy meat. The member for Rotherham was sacked from Labour's front bench for speaking out about rape gangs. Does the Prime Minister now recognise that sacking people for telling the truth creates a chilling effect that means victims aren't listened to?
Well, I'm very happy to call out anybody who hasn't acted properly in these cases. I've done it many, many times before, and it doesn't matter to me which political party they're in. I'll call them out and I will condemn them. Mr. Speaker, when I was Chief Prosecutor, I took measures to confront this head-on. The first of the mass prosecutions for an Asian gang was in Rochdale. My team came to see me. It put a number of Asian men in the dock. They wanted the green light for the first of these cases to take place. I gave that green light, but on one condition, because it came to my attention that one of the men that was going into the dock had previously been arrested but not charged. And I said, you can bring the first of these mass prosecutions, but only if you look back at the file where we weren't charged and tell me what went wrong with a report so that I can start to put it right. And that's what started the reforms I brought about. So that's the approach I took in practice, whilst others were tweeting and talking. It's the approach I would take now in any case where there's wrongdoing here. But what we've got to do now, Professor Jay has said this, we have had a number of strong findings. There are 20 on the table from Professor Jay. We've got to get on with action. Don't block it this afternoon.
That's the first mention in all this debate, Tim, that I've heard of Sarah Champion, who was indeed sacked from the Labour front bench in 2017, I think it was, for an article she wrote about grooming gangs. I think she wrote it in The Sun, and her specific crime in that article, I think she said that Britain has a problem with the rape of white girls by British Pakistani men. She was responding, I think, at the time unfortunately, to a grooming case that hadn't entirely involved British Pakistani men, but involved men from a variety of other parts of the world around there as well. But still, you'd have thought there'd have been more chatter about that. What did you think of all that generally, Tim?
Well, I mean, this is, I think, when people complain about Prime Minister's questions to people like me and say, well, you're far too taken with the sort of Punch and Judy show and, people testing each other's arguments and all the rest of it. This is what it ought to be like. And I think this is what people think it probably ought to be like. Sober points on both sides. I mean, Starmer's answer to that was interesting because he said, I'm perfectly prepared to call out anybody who behaves badly over this, whichever party they're in. And then he didn't quite call out anybody, either Sarah Champion or the person who dismissed her. So it's an awkward terrain for both sides here. I mean, the sensible way forward, surely, is that you enact the J proposals, and that's now on the government. They can say the Tories didn't do it all they wanted, and they can talk about their bill this afternoon and how important that is, but that doesn't have the 18 or 20 J proposals in it. It has some progress in some areas, but, Starmer should now be put under pressure to pass that stuff himself, and then if there's still a need for an inquiry, then maybe you have one. I mean, these things don't seem to be mutually exclusive to me. But it's interesting, we're now getting into the more sort of slightly trickier terrain, that there are, social and racial issues here, and that's certainly what Musk has been trying to play on. And, bluntly, I think, the people who've been on the victim side in this would say that there has been a conspiracy of silence that doesn't just cover the people involved, but a lot of the people who've investigated it since. But Starmer's answer there on his own role was interesting, added to the sum of human knowledge, and, reflects reasonably well on him.
And yet, Alistair, no sign of the elephant.
Well, no sign of the elephant. And actually, funnily enough, I was making notes on the way in today saying, how quaint, Prime Minister's question time, all our sort of old-fashioned Mother of Parliament standing up and Mr. Speaker and the Right Honourable and all the rest of it, when it's all been sort of created by this mad online chatter with Musk said that Starmer was hiding terrible things, etc. But actually, it's not quaint. It's, as Tim says, this is actually rather reassuring, how it should be, and not, unfortunately, how it is most of the time. Still very little mention of Elon. And it's also getting into difficult areas. You have that terribly difficult thing of a black woman talking about race. It's any white man lecturing a black woman on race is already on difficult territory.
Yeah.
And so they're sort of, again, just respectfully sort of crossing, not I was thinking going around the ropes again rather than actually engaging. But in a very, I think, it adds to the sum of human knowledge. It's how it should be. And I'm finding this difficult to dismiss as anything apart from quite constructive.
What a blow. Let's hear the next question.
Mr. Speaker, we need to focus on what this is really about. This is not about the Prime Minister's work in the CPS. And I would say very respectfully to the Prime Minister, it's not about you. It is about the victims. Be a leader, not a lawyer. We know that people were scared to tell the truth because they thought they would be called racist. If we want to stop this from ever happening again, we cannot be afraid. The Labour Party has adopted the APPG definition of Islamophobia. That same APPG report said talking about sex groomers was an example of Islamophobia. This is exactly why people are scared to tell the truth. And the lack of clarity means that innocent British Muslims are smeared by association. That is not fair, and only a national inquiry can solve this. So will the Prime Minister look again at the Labour Party's adoption of the definition of Islamophobia, its chilling effect, and rule out introducing it in government?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will call out any aspect that has prevented anybody coming forward or any case going forward when it comes to violence against women and girls, child abuse or child sexual exploitation, as I have been doing now for the best part of 15 years. But, yes, some people will say there should be a further inquiry. But that does... I accept that, but that means all the victims and survivors who are going to give evidence need to be in a position to do so. Not all of them are. I've been speaking to them. There are some that do think they are. It will take time. All of the institutions will have to give evidence. That will take time. This will delay things till 2031 also. But Mr. Speaker, we already know what the major flaws are. And my argument is we should get on with that action. And that's why we're bringing forward the bill this afternoon.
Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that she's now tried to turn it on to the Labour Party. It's also interesting that she came up with, I think, what is one of her best ever soundbites that characterises Starmer, be a leader, not a lawyer, which kind of sums up the bloke in the weeds, pernickety leader, versus the bloke who knows his own mind and gets out there. In a big punch-up PMQs, that would be quite a good attack line, and I expect we'll hear it again. In this context, it sort of fell onto a damp rag and disappeared into the wider debate. I mean, look, Labour has got itself in a pickle before over definitions of this and that. We'll all remember under Jeremy Corbyn that Labour were under fire for refusing to adapt the internationally recognised definition of anti-Semitism. And now Badenoch is hitting him with, well, actually, you've made a mistake in adopting the definition of Islamophobia because that's causing people not to speak out. Starmer again says, I will speak out against those who cause people to speak out. Doesn't then say anything about that particular issue. You wonder whether he'll go off and have a quiet think about that behind the scenes. But
I mean, the thing is, this is right at the heart of this issue. And I say this literally as a question: is it relevant to call the grooming gangs Muslim? Is that relevant? Kemi Badenoch would say it absolutely is. There are those. And I'm sure Keir Starmer would think this, it's relevant to call them British Pakistani because that's what they are. Calling them explicitly Muslim, there are a lot of people, there are a lot of communities, this is something I mentioned at the weekend when I was talking about this with Jeff Norcott, but I remember Andrew Norfolk telling me about this when we wrote about this long ago, looking at Blackburn specifically, where you could divide the Muslim population between people of Pakistani Kashmiri heritage and people of Indian Gujarati heritage. And every single one of these cases was from the Pakistani Kashmiri heritage community. And so when you talk about these as Muslim grooming gangs, you're dragging in a lot of people. So maybe, I'm just saying this, maybe there is a case that if you talk about Muslim grooming gangs, that should fall foul of an Islamophobia definition.
I would agree, but I would also quite glad that you said it and I haven't said it on the record so that I don't have to say anything that might be held against me. What Tim said about that nice sort of soundbite, but she had actually just said it's not about you, and I don't think it's been very clear he's not made it about him. And I also think when it comes to Islamophobia, it's a pretty dodgy territory for the Conservatives, who did promise their own inquiry into Islamophobia within the Conservative Party that then completely failed to happen and led to resignations within their own party. So I think it's quite difficult ground. And Kemi Badenoch does have something of a reputation as a black woman who doesn't seem to be too afraid of letting racists say what they want. It's almost like, she saw Kamala Harris and thought, well, there's no point in opposing them. So I do think going in on Islamophobia was a slightly strange tactic when, get your own house in order.
Although it'll work. I think we've got one more question. Let's listen to that.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has effectively told us that he's not able to do two things at the same time. This issue of a delay is a weak excuse. And I would say to him that by refusing this inquiry, he is enabling those people who wish to smear all British Muslims based on the actions of a small minority. He is talking about distraction tactics. Let us have the truth. The Prime Minister cannot tell the House the full scale of the scandal. He doesn't want questions asked of Labour politicians who may be complicit. He won't listen to the victims. He won't listen to the victims who are calling for a national inquiry. He is making this all about a bill this afternoon. Later today, he will tell Labour MPs, including in Telford, Rochdale, Bristol, Derby, Aylesbury, Oldham, Bradford, Peterborough, Coventry, Middlesbrough, Newcastle, Ramsgate, tell all of these people to vote against a national inquiry into the gangs which have systematically gang raped children in their constituencies. This is one of the worst scandals in British history, Mr. Speaker.
Sorry? This is a very, very important issue that does matter to the country. It matters to all our constituents. I want to make sure they can hear what's being said by the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this is one of the worst scandals in recent British history. But how are they going to explain to their constituents that obeying his whip is more important than doing the right thing?
She's right to say it's one of the worst scandals. It's terrible. That's why I acted on it. Her recently acquired view that it's a scandal, having spent a lot of time on social media over Christmas, not once in 8 years did she stand here and say what she's just said. Not once in 8 years. They didn't act on the recommendations. They want a national inquiry. We had a national inquiry, the J inquiry, the J report. 20 recommendations, not a single one implemented. Not a single one implemented. And she said you can do two things at once. You can't kill the bill this afternoon, wreck that bill, and protect children. Mr. Speaker, there was a dreadful case of Sarah Sharif that everybody will remember. This was the girl taken out of school and abused by an abuser. The bill this afternoon fixes that gap. And I know, I'm looking across, I know there are honourable members on the benches opposite who know very well that what's in this bill is necessary, that it's the right thing to do, and that would want to vote for this bill. I urge them to think twice about following this short-sighted, misguided, bandwagon-jumping approach of the non-leadership of the Leader of the Opposition. I urge them to.
Well, first up, it was a surprise for me to find that I just made a very difficult point about Islamophobia and then to hear Kemi Badenoch immediately making the same one in the dispatch box. So thank you, Kemi Badenoch, for that, not least because of my Twitter experience over the next couple of days. Alistair, what do you think of all that?
I thought that she may have made that point, but she did suddenly slip slightly into the petulant. I mean, obviously, classic telling a man off for not being able to multitask, which I'll include with some mother-in-law jokes later in the show. But
it doesn't stop it being true, though.
Well, weak excuse. And it felt a little bit petulant. And actually, the thing is, Starmer's return argument, I thought Starmer was good right up until we've gone from imploring to urging a few times. But I thought his response was quite strong in that he was simply saying, you had the opportunity, you had 20 recommendations, you've not done it. And it was fairly simply stated in fact. And she was heckling from the sideline, which no one could hear. I thought he dealt with that very, very well, actually, because it's been a very grown-up PMQs, which I'm delighted to see. And he got a couple of nice little barbs in, didn't he, being online over Christmas and that sort of thing. And it does, the subtext being that there is an enormous amount of bandwagon jumping. They've seen an issue. There is a cynicism at work here that hasn't really been at work on display in PMQs. I thought he dealt with that pretty well, and I don't think she came off best.
Tim?
Well, look, it's the job of the Leader of the Opposition to oppose. That's what Starmer did when he was the Leader of the Opposition. I mean, I agree with Alistair, the tone slightly slipped at the end. I thought it was interesting that they were very much putting it on individual Labour MPs there, saying, this has been happening on your patch, are you going to vote to oppose an inquiry? Because you can pretty much guarantee that every Tory poster and Facebook ad drop in those seats for the next few months and come the next election will be to do with how those MPs behave this afternoon. I think, Starmer's response was good. I thought it was slightly surprising, looking back on the whole thing, that he didn't bring up more sort of specific examples of things that this bill this afternoon is going to prevent, that would have humanised it a bit more rather than making it a sort of arid debate about parliamentary procedure. And I think overall, he accused her of lack of leadership. She's accused him of lack of leadership. Actually, I think this was a pretty clear score draw. The winner was both of them because they both behaved like grown-ups. And as a regular analyst of PMQs, I would say I don't want this every week. But if you can't do it in a week like this, then when can you? Pat on the back for both of them.
No, that's we're holding up our scorecards, and they are good for both. That's great. Look, stick with us. Lara Spirit will come rushing in next with the best for the rest from the back benches. This is Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio.
This is Times Radio. This is Times Radio.
Hey business owners, need help taking payments online? DAB Digital Radio, online and on your smart speaker, Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio.
Now let's take a look at some of the other exchanges at PMQs, and the Times Politics newsletter editor Lara Spirit has come somersaulting into the studio to tell us all about them.
Hello Hugo, how are you?
I'm very well. What have you got for us?
I've got Sarah Davy for us first, who asks, predictably but I think entirely justifiably, about the decision to have another commission on social care, and the fact that actually we're not going to see anything until 2028 at the earliest, at which point we're expected to have some magical political consensus, which means we'll go into the election with a plan. I think that he's right to raise this question here, so just take a listen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Happy New Year to you. And can I join others by offering my personal condolences to the Prime Minister on the loss of his brother? And can I take this opportunity to express my sadness at the passing of a much-loved member of the Liberal Democrat family, Baroness Jenny Randerson. Mr. Speaker, fixing the care crisis is urgent. for the millions of people, elderly and disabled, who are not getting the care they need, for the millions of family carers who are making huge sacrifices to fill the gap, for the NHS, where over 12,000 people are stuck in hospital beds because they can't get out of hospitals, the care's not there for them. The Prime Minister is right to say we need a cross-party approach today, but as Sir Andrew Dillot has said today, that needn't take 3 years. So will the Prime Minister please speed up this work so 2025 is the year we finally rise to the challenge of fixing care?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for raising this important issue and thank him for his condolences. Yes, it is right we need to get this right. I want a cross-party consensus on this and invite him to work with us on this, as I know he will. But it is important, and he's right to say we need some action now as well. And that is why it's important I point out the immediate action that we've taken, the £3.7 billion of additional funding in the budget for social care, another 86 million to allow 7,800 more disabled and elderly people to live more independent lives, and of course the increased carers allowance. And the way in which we've set this up is in stages so that we can act and improve as we go along, but making sure that we've got consensus for the bigger changes that may be proposed in the review. And I do invite him and members across the House to work with us on this so that we can get this right and make sure that what we put in place endures beyond just a few years. Thank you.
Lara, care's a big thing for the Lib Dems generally. What's he trying to do there? Just sort of flag it up and boost it? I mean, what's the...
Yeah, I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
But it's a very big thing for him, as you've just said. But also, I think the government were careful to try and get the news that they wouldn't be having their National Care Service, as it was called during the election campaign, during parliamentary recess, a few days before Parliament came back. And then we had that big speech from Starmer on Monday where he was talking about how he'd spend his extra £22.6 billion for the NHS. And clearly there was a hope that social care, which he's trying to say actually they're doing something about because they're doing this commission, actually what's I think much more likely is that they are kicking the can down the road, possibly permanently again, even though this is a seriously important crisis. So for that reason, I think it's important that Ed Davey raised it. It was interesting there that he said 3.7 billion, I think it was, for social care, but there was only an extra 600 million in the budget for social care. When you compare that to the vast sums being held out for the NHS, which many people will think is justified, you do have to say that actually that sector is looking a little bit neglected.
Yeah, well, do either of you have pressing views on care? Because otherwise I'll jump to the next.
Well, I think the honest question would have been, this is the only issue anyone knows I know anything about, so I'm going to ask about it. And the honest answer would be, we've got to try and fix the NHS. It's a complete nightmare. We haven't got any money. We've put some money in as a stopgap, and frankly, we want this all to go away for a couple of years.
Although it's got to be better than, there's a very funny bit in Anthony Selden's book, Johnson at 10, about when Johnson made his pledge that we've got social care sorted, and walked back into number 10 to an entire staff going, what have you just said? So,
other books on Boris Johnson are available.
Lara, what's next?
So we're actually going to do the second Ed Davey question, which is a bit more jolly than the social care question, and which is about the weekend row between Elon Musk and Nigel Farage.
For Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid if the government doesn't bring in these long-term social care reforms this year, their NHS reforms, this Parliament will fail. So I hope he will revisit the timetable. But moving on, Mr. Speaker, while the honourable member for Clacton may miss out on his big allowance from Elon Musk, the spectre of the richest man in the world trying to buy a British political party should give us all pause for thought. And after years of the Conservatives taking millions of pounds of Russian money, will the Prime Minister now work with us to bring in long overdue reforms of party funding so that power in this country lies with the voters and not wealthy overseas oligarchs?
I think we all had a smile on Sunday when the honourable member said how cool it was to have the support of Musk, only for Musk to say he should be removed. Just a few hours later, that's the rough and tough of politics. And of course, we're looking at the question of funding more generally.
Yeah, I mean, we should also remember that Musk did call Ed Davey a snivelling cretin, so he's had he's had his fair share as well, Laura.
Yeah, I mean, what Starmer did there was issue, I think, maybe his only joke of PMQs, and then very quickly, whispered that basically they don't know what they're going to do about this. And actually, this was something that I listened to Lucy Powell on a different radio station on Sunday night, who is, of course, responsible for the elections bill, which is possibly to carry forward some reforms. They've said they're considering it on this question of whether or not you should necessarily be able to funny money through a British arm of your company as a foreign citizen to donate to political parties. She said then it wasn't necessarily within the spirit of the law to do something like that, but she hasn't yet made any commitments on that. And it is a really sticky issue for them that I think they're not really necessarily sure what they're going to do on at the moment. And for that reason, you can see why Starmer much preferred making a joke about it than saying anything on the substance.
Alistair, finally the elephant trumps.
Well, yes, but also I think
trumpets.
Well, something like that. Yeah. I think it was also quite interesting to see the reform hump in the House, basically responding as though they were being ribbed at a best man speech. Like, said, oh, what's that like? Because it's quite embarrassing for Farage, and also he is the only person who can say he's not just the leader of his party, he's the owner of it. So I thought that, and doing his sort of...
Well, what's the group noun for a collection of Reform MPs?
I've got some things that I don't think I'm allowed to do on the radio for that, but it's like
an employeeship.
Well, it's a rump. I think would be one way of looking at it. But I just think they were there, kind of going, "Oh, well, he's done this," and it's quite interesting that we've had the sensible debate, but actually, the stuff that Musk was talking about has led to the sensible debate, and then we come back to that, and they're all sitting there like naughty schoolboys going, "Oh, we're messing with the big boys," when they've all had that picture taken in front of that appalling portrait of Mr. Trump in his tennis whites.
Yes,
so,
with Elon Musk wearing his bomber jacket.
Yes.
His fleece-lined bomber jacket in Florida.
Yeah.
Which is bold. Tim?
Well, yes, party funding is always one of those issues that the big parties talk a lot about and then never do anything about, because the second you start going after big donors to get at the Tories, they point out that quite a lot of unions give a load of money that they don't really get their say-so of their membership for handing over as well. So it gets very thorny, and the Lib Dems and the small parties get very hot under the collar about it, and then absolutely nothing ever happens. Glad we could get back to some proper raw political cynicism at the end of an otherwise edifying programme.
That's us done. Thank you very much indeed, Tim Shipman. Thank you very much indeed, Alistair Barrie. Thank you very much indeed, Lara Spirit. And Lara will be in your inbox in a couple of hours with the PMQs Unpacked roundup, won't you?
I will, it's true.
See, told you. Times subscribers can sign up to that at thetimes.com/newsletters. And you can hear all of this again on the Politics Unpacked podcast. And it's a race against the clock to see whether we get that published before Laura sends out her email. Watch this space. Coming up next, it is, of course, the Departure Lounge. This is Hugo Rifkind here on Times Radio.
The Story. The
Specialist treatment and extraordinary care